You just have to be more suspicious of your opponent if they're handing you that pawn. And we have to see something from Hikaru with the white pieces. Dina, congratulations. You correctly predicted b3.
Yes, and I'm so excited to see that. Now the question is e3? Yes, I was gonna say, or g3. Whoa. G6, this fianchetto, we talked about it yesterday, Aman, and you said you were not a fan of this. I believe Jan Nepomniachtchi did that against Hikaru.
That's right. We've definitely seen these types of positions before. For Hikaru, I think the nice thing for him is that at least there's a very clear imbalance. I can't speak and say, oh, it's immediately better for him or anything, but there's a clear imbalance, right? We have a bishop traded for a knight. Also, the pawn structure is completely shattered. So I think what he might be trying to do is trade the d pawn for the c pawn here, and then black would have a number of pawn weaknesses. The doubled f pawns we can clearly see stacked on top of each other, but also the pawn in the middle of the board on d5 will become isolated without any pawn support on its flanks. And so maybe even though he's going to be, lacking some central control and certainly lacking the bishop, which is a very strong piece in this soon to be open position, I definitely think he could try to play positionally against that d pawn. And yeah, that might be his plan here.
Very interesting. And it looks like Hikaru knows everything inside and out because he literally spent only 15 seconds and he took that knight with his bishop almost pre moving. Now we see our favorite pawn structure, the isolated pawn on d5. And, well, the c pawn could be a potential weakness as well for white, but probably just putting it on c3 and chilling and saying, what are you going to do with your bishop?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Pawn to c3 will completely fix the d pawn. Great tip when any of us are playing against an isolated pawn like the d pawn. A lot of players, I think, make a mistake and they think, oh, it's isolated, it's got no support. Let me attack it and win it. But usually, what you need to do first is pin it down so it can't move. So, as you said, moves like c3, rook d1 are much more important. And once you hold it down, then you can start piling up the pressure. Now, there's definitely no big advantage to speak of here, but I have to say, structurally, this is definitely a position that Hikaru can play. So we'll see how it develops here. Magnus cannot be unhappy with this opening. There's a positional deficit, but look how strong that black bishop is. There's pressure on c3 just as there is pressure on d5.
I will add that I'm surprised by how fast Hikaru removed this knight, almost saying, I don't want to trade because I want to play against your bishop and against your d5 pawn, and if you trade, then I wouldn't just have enough chances to play for a win.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if he's bothered by the trade, but you're right. It could be that he wants to maintain some pieces. Also, I think he's just kind of clearing the way. Like he wants the knight to watch over the c3 pawn while he puts pressure on the d5 pawn, and he needs the knight out of the way in order to attack it.
Yeah, and the only active plan here for black would be to push f4, potentially playing g5 and then f4, or somewhere sacrificing the f4 in order to make this pawn strong. But unlike any other typical isolated pawn structures, there is a c3 pawn, right? So even
Yeah.
if the d pawn would be deviated, it would still, like, d5 pawn would not become a pass pawn. It would still be an isolated pawn. So honestly, other than just sit and wait, I don't see any active plan for Magnus.
Yeah, there's always things the players can do here, but I expect that we will see the evaluation by the computer remain very close to the center of the board, very close to 0.00, just by the nature of the position. Moves that Hikaru is probably going to consider, I would say a rook on d3 will be quite well placed, just because it also defends the c3 pawn, so you can kind of defend your pawn while doubling the rooks on the d pawn. So I'm wondering if we're going to see something like that. As for Magnus, he doesn't need to do anything. So while you're right, Dina, he might not have an active plan. Guess what? He doesn't need one. He can just sit there, put all the pressure on c3, and say, if you ever win my d5 pawn, I'm definitely going to win your c3 pawn. I'm up 1-0 in the match. Let's see what you can do.
And the next game, Magnus would be getting white, which also helps this whole situation. But I do love the fact that we saw h4 and h5 for Hikaru because that completely stops any activity of black on the king side. Once again, maybe it's not needed, but it's a nice way of putting your pawns. And when you're playing with a knight against the bishop, it is pretty smart to put your pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop, simply because you are restricting this bishop, as long as you don't lose those pawns in a way.
That's right. Yeah, and in Endgame, the pawns on dark squares for white with that bishop might be a problem, but we're so far from that happening. And as you can see, Hikaru is willing to make that trade, bishop for knight. He's not holding back. In fact, knight takes e5 is probably a move that he would be reasonably interested in. But at the same time, I do think that Magnus is going to be okay with this. Let's see how Hikaru manages the clock and the position. Because if you take this exact same position with 6 minutes less on either clock, obviously someone's getting flagged. So I think he's just trying to, play moves, whittle the clock down, and just see if he can break through.
Indeed, if we had a situation with 30 seconds versus 1 minute, then Hikaru would just go all of a sudden aggressive and just complicate the position so that he could win in the time scramble.
Yeah, and look, there's not that much going on. I said that the evaluation bar very likely to hover around the equality mark, and that's exactly what we see. C4 has been played, and very likely to be mass exchanges here because, yeah, the position is definitely even. The bishop does well with pawns on both sides of the board. Now, if the queens get traded here, I do think the position is a draw. Even if the knight and the bishop trade, I also think that. The position could be a draw. Now, interesting. Does this maybe allow for? I was thinking about Queen D4 at the end. How is that endgame?
Yeah, and then after f4, forcing the passed pawn to be created in the pawn endgame, but then queen could go to f6, but then just bringing the king, and black has
So
no move.
yeah, that's interesting. F4. There's also Queen D4, and why don't we put that on the board? I mean, this is what the players are thinking about. If King F6, then I was thinking also
f4.
Queen
No.
B6,
Oh,
right?
queen
Queen
b6, yeah.
B6 just wins the pawn. And
Yeah.
if you take the king move back, and actually man,
Would
the
have played
live
f6.
position did not play it. That's a massive
Oh
opportunity for
no.
Hikaru. I guess we'll go back to the live position, but I'm willing to say pretty certainly that he almost could win a pawn in that variation, guaranteed.
With the queen to d7
Yeah.
after f6, and the trade once again is not in black's favor, because white would just have a pass pawn in the king endgame
Wow,
and the
that's
pawn
I can't
endgame.
say for sure, like, guaranteed win for Hikaru, nothing like that. It wasn't that type of miss, but wow, I think that was a very significant moment in this match, and it just kind of happened out of nowhere. We were talking about trades, even me. I was like, "Oh, it's going to be around 0.00 the entire time." So he just maybe wasn't looking for it, but he paused. He really thought about it, and I felt like he sensed there was a moment to calculate. He had 7 minutes on the clock. I bet he's going to wish that he spent a little more time on that.
Yeah, because this is those moments when you lose a guard and something can happen. And if only for Magnus, it takes only a little bit of too much relaxing in the moment, and then
Mm,
Hikaru could certainly have chances. And once again, with the time advantage. But I also want to add, we already talked about it yesterday, if our audience remembers. But whenever you are playing a queen endgame with a knight and a bishop, usually a queen and a knight are so much stronger, just because there is nothing that queen cannot do that bishop can, which is not the same case for the knight. So those two could reach more harmony and more attacking chances, and even just forks and tricks and blunders in the time scramble, just because the knight is so tricky.
yeah, I agree with that. The knight is the piece I'd rather have here, definitely. Also, considering the match situation, I think Magnus is, more than comfortable making a draw, whereas Hikaru is the one saying, I'd like to try to generate something from this. I'm up a minute, but truthfully, 5 minutes in this position for Magnus should be enough. Yeah, that's right. A nice threat there with b5.
And queen d5, white does not want to trade, but white should always watch out for b5, similar to black, who should always watch out to the queen activation here. For now, king is covering all the squares, it looks like.
Yeah, I would say that at this point, I know we keep talking about that moment missed, but to me, that was the biggest chance of the entire end game. So really unfortunate that Hikaru, at the very least, didn't spend more time there because you knew that he knew something was up there, right? He paused, started thinking. He was definitely looking at that exact thing. He must have misevaluated something. But okay, back to the live position here. He's obviously trying to squeeze something out of this. Notice how Black's bishop is always on that square, just two squares in between the bishop and the knight. So any square the knight's trying to move to in a forward motion, I mean, it's just not possible. When the knight was sitting
Yeah.
on d3, the bishop was on d6. So Magnus doing a good job so far containing the pieces.
And if you take this knight and just place it anywhere on the board, unfortunately, you cannot even find the right square for the knight where it would be powerful, other than on f6, of course. Just because, like, let's say even if you put it on d4, the bishop would always attack, and then the knight would have nowhere to go because of the pawns. How beautifully pawns are restraining the knight, together with the bishop, making it a perfect harmony.
Yeah, let's take a moment to observe dark squared bishop for Magnus, light square pawns everywhere. That's always going to be a pretty good combination. But Hikaru is really not risking anything in this position. He's playing on. He's up on time. Magnus is doing enough in terms of defense right now, but if Hikaru can kind of shuffle a little bit, maybe make a pawn move eventually, and keep that distance on time, then you're talking about an advantage.
Yeah, although you notice how the time advantage already like really low down to 30 seconds only.
Yep, and pay attention, guys. I know we keep talking about that bishop and knight, but there they are again.